The first thing Maggie Underwood learned about the land was that every man who had ever looked at it had called it dead. And the first thing she learned about Nelson Hayes was that he was no different from any of them. She arrived in Cutter's Creek, Texas, on a Thursday morning in April of 1882, seated in the back of a freight wagon driven by a man named Orlo who chewed tobacco and did not speak unless he had to. The land stretched out around her in every direction like a rumpled brown blanket that had been thrown down in a hurry and left to bake. The sky above it was enormous and pale and indifferent. The scrub grass grew in thin, reluctant patches between rocks and red clay, and the wind that moved across it all carried dust the color of rust. Maggie had come from a farm in Missouri, a real farm, green and thick and smelling of rain-wet earth, and she gripped the side of the wagon with both hands and told herself that she was not going to cry about the difference. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of 40 acres of land in the Texas Panhandle that had passed to her through the tangled, unfortunate logic of a dead husband's will. Her husband, Raymond Underwood, had purchased the acreage sight unseen from a land company out of Fort Worth, convinced it would be worth something someday. Raymond had been the kind of man who was always convinced something would be worth something someday. Then he caught a fever in the winter of 1881 and was gone by February, and the someday became Maggie's problem alone. She could have sold it. Her sister Clara, back in Independence, had told her to sell it and come home. Her brother-in-law had told her the same thing, with more feeling and less kindness. But something stubborn and private had taken root in Maggie during the long months of Raymond's illness, some refusal to let herself be turned back, and so she had packed what she owned into 2 trunks and a carpet bag, and she had come. Cutter's Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by a man named Beaumont, a small church with a cracked bell, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a post office that was also the barber shop, and a livery stable at the far end of the main street. There was a school that only operated when the schoolteacher was sober, which was approximately 6 months of the year. There were perhaps 200 people living within 10 miles of the town center, most of them ranchers or hands, and they all knew each other's business with the thoroughness of people who had very little else to occupy them. Orlo deposited Maggie and her trunks in front of the general store and accepted payment without ceremony and drove away. And Maggie stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of Beaumont's and looked at the street, and the street looked back at her without any particular warmth. Inside the store, Edmund Beaumont was a barrel-shaped man with a white mustache and the deliberate manner of someone who had decided long ago that rushing was for younger people. He knew about her land. He seemed to know about it before she had finished introducing herself, which she supposed was the nature of small towns. "Underwood parcel," he said, nodding slowly and measuring her with the kind of look that takes stock without appearing to. "Out east of town, past the Hayes property." "Yes," Maggie said. "I'd like to arrange for someone to take me out there tomorrow morning." "You can arrange it," Beaumont said. "Whether you'll want to stay is another matter." She looked at him evenly. "I didn't come all this way to not want to stay, Mr. Beaumont." He had the grace to look slightly chastened. He told her about a widow woman named Mrs. Hooper who kept a room and gave decent meals, and Maggie spent her first night in Cutter's Creek sleeping in a narrow bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar, and listening to the wind work at the shutters with patient, persistent hands. The next morning, a young man from the livery named Cord drove her out in a buckboard. The road, such as it was, ran east out of town along a line of fence posts that marked the edge of the Hayes cattle range. The range was large. She could see cattle moving in loose, unhurried groups across the brown grass, and once she saw a rider far off on a ridge, sitting still against the sky, watching something she could not see. The Hayes land was dry, but it was working land that carried livestock and purpose, and it looked alive in the way that hard country can look alive when something is being made of it. Her land was something else. It sat at the end of a track that peeled away from the main road and crossed a shallow, dry creek bed, and then climbed a small, rocky rise before flattening out again. The 40 acres were bounded on the west by a low stone fence, partly collapsed, and on the other 3 sides by nothing but the natural inclinations of the terrain. There was a house on the property, if you were charitable with the definition. It was a one-room structure of sun-bleached timber, patched in 2 places with scraps of different wood, and it listed slightly to the left as though it had been leaning against something that was no longer there. A stone chimney rose from one end with genuine ambition. The rest of the structure did not share that ambition. There was a well, which was something. And there was the ground itself. Red clay and pale dust and stones the color of old bones, cracked in places into a pattern like broken pottery. Here and there a clump of tough grass grew with the grim persistence of something that has not been told it should give up. Nothing else. No trees. No garden. No shade to speak of except the shadow of the house in the mornings. Cord scratched the back of his neck and looked at it all with the expression of someone who has been asked a question he cannot answer politely. "It's a fair stretch of land," he said, which was clearly the most generous thing he could think to say. "It's a start," Maggie said, and climbed down from the buckboard. She walked the property in the morning heat, her boots raising small puffs of red dust with each step, and she tried to see it not as it was but as it might become. She knew soil. She had grown up working the earth beside her father, who had taught her the difference between dead ground and sleeping ground. She crouched down and dug her fingers into the earth near the base of the collapsed stone wall, where the soil was slightly darker, slightly more sheltered, and when she brought it up to her nose it had a faint smell to it, distant but real, the smell of something that had once been alive and might be again. She was still crouched there, turning a clod of earth over in her hands and thinking about drainage and seed and effort, when she heard the fence creak. The fence that ran along the western edge of her property, the one that separated her 40 acres from the Hayes Range, was in better condition than the stone wall, because it was the Hayes fence, and the Hayes property was maintained by someone who took maintenance seriously. It was a good wooden rail fence, solid and upright, and leaning on the top rail of it was a man she had not heard arrive. He was somewhere around 30 years old, lean in the way of men who spend their lives outdoors, with a weathered face that would have been handsome if it had permitted itself any softness, which it did not. He wore a plain work shirt, dark with sweat at the collar, and a hat pushed back on his head at the angle of a man who has forgotten it is there. He had gray eyes that were direct in a way that stopped just short of rude, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who is uncertain whether to be curious or annoyed. "You're the Underwood woman," he said. It was not a question exactly, and it was not a greeting exactly. It occupied some neutral territory between the two. "Maggie Underwood," she said, standing up and brushing the earth from her hands. "And you must be on the Hayes property." "Nelson Hayes," he said, "my fence line." "And my side of it," she said pleasantly. Something moved in those gray eyes, not amusement quite, but something adjacent to it. He pushed off the fence rail and stood straight, and she could see that he was taller than she had first reckoned, with the kind of physical ease that comes from years of working with horses and cattle and difficult ground. "You're thinking about staying on," he said. It was still not quite a question. "I am staying on," she said. "I'm going to fix that house and I'm going to work this land." He looked out across her 40 acres in a long, sweeping way, the way a man looks at something when he is trying to be honest without being unkind. He did not entirely succeed at the kindness part. "Miss Underwood," he said, "this land is about as worthless as land gets in this county. The soil is mostly clay. The water table is deep. Nothing grows out here that didn't already decide to grow here before you arrived, and none of that is anything you'd want to eat." He said it flatly, not with cruelty but with the matter-of-fact tone of a man delivering a weather report. He had probably been the kind of boy who told other children the truth about hard things before he learned that people generally preferred comfortable half-truths. Maggie looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the ground. Then she looked back at him. "Thank you for that assessment, Mr. Hayes," she said. "It's just the facts," he said. "Yes," she said, "they usually are." She turned back to examining the soil near the stone wall. After a moment she heard him push off the fence and ride away, the sound of his horse's hooves dropping back into the general noise of the wind. She stood up straight and put her hands on her hips and looked out at the dusty red acres stretched before her, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not discouragement. It was more like determination, which sometimes wears the same face as anger and is very difficult to tell apart. She planted a garden anyway. It began small, and it began with stubbornness more than strategy, though strategy came soon after. Maggie spent her first 2 weeks in the house on the property, which she repaired with her own hands, and the help of a half-day she paid 2 men from town to assist with. The roof got new timber on the east corner where the original had rotted through. The door got a new hinge. She chinked the gaps in the walls with a mixture of clay and dry grass and let it cure in the sun, which was at least something the sun was reliable for. She hauled water up from the well twice a day, morning and evening, and she began amending the soil along the south face of the house, where the afternoon shade would be longest, and the ground retained just the smallest edge of moisture. She had brought seeds with her from Missouri, tucked carefully into a tin box in her carpet bag. Tomatoes and beans and squash and 2 kinds of lettuce and herbs, thyme and sage and lavender, because lavender was something her mother had grown, and the smell of it was like a letter from a better time. She had beets and carrots and onions too, and a small paper envelope of flower seeds, zinnias and sunflowers, because she believed that beauty was not a luxury but a kind of proof that you meant to stay. She turned the soil with a mattock. She worked it deep, deeper than any casual gardener would bother with, working around the stones and breaking up the clay and mixing in what organic matter she could find. Dried manure from the corner of the property where some previous animal had lived, dry grass, the ash from her stove. She worked for hours each morning while the air was still cool, and she learned the ground inch by inch the way you learn a difficult book slowly, with patience, with a willingness to be surprised. The neighbors had opinions. Mrs. Hooper, who had seen her off when she moved to the property, sent a note via the supply rider that expressed doubt in the gentlest possible terms. Beaumont, when she came to town for supplies, looked at her seed purchases with the resigned expression of a man watching money leave someone's hands for the last time. And then there was the opinion she had already received from Nelson Hayes, delivered on the morning of her arrival with the efficiency of a man who saw no point in letting a person maintain false hope. She did not see him again for 2 weeks. She did not think about him much in that time, or she told herself she did not, which was almost the same thing. The first shoots appeared on a Tuesday morning at the end of April. She was on her knees in the early light, and the bean seedlings had come up in 2 small rows, pale and curved like question marks, which she thought was appropriate. She laughed out loud at them. She had been alone on the property for 2 weeks, and she laughed out loud at a row of bean seedlings. And if that was not the behavior of someone finding her footing, then she did not know what was. It was that same morning that she heard the fence creak. She was so absorbed in the seedlings that she had not heard a horse, and when she looked up, Nelson Hayes was standing at the fence again, his arms folded on the top rail, watching her with those gray eyes that did not reveal much more than what was absolutely necessary. She stood up and looked at him. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He looked at the freshly turned earth, at the small green question marks of the bean seedlings, at the careful rows she had made. Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door moved by a draft too small to feel. "You actually planted it," he said. "I told you I was going to work the land," she said. "I thought you meant cattle," he said. "I meant a garden," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the scrub behind him and stirred the dust, and he squinted against it without appearing to notice that he was doing it. "The water," he said at last. "You'll need a lot of it. That well runs deep. You'll spend half your day hauling." "Then I'll spend half my day hauling," she said. Another silence. Then, with the care of a man handling something he does not entirely know how to handle, he said, "There's a seep spring about 200 yards north of your fence line. On my property. It runs shallow in spring and early summer. It's not much, but if you cut a channel along the fence line, it might carry enough to wet down that bed without you dragging buckets every hour." Maggie looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her, and his jaw was set in the way of a man who has said something he did not plan to say and is not sure yet whether he should have said it. "That's a generous offer," she said carefully. "It's a practical suggestion," he said, in the tone of a man making a clear correction. "Of course," she said. "Either way, thank you." He gave a short nod, pushed off the fence, and rode away again. But this time, she noticed, he went slowly. Not the way a man rides when he is going somewhere with purpose, but the way a man rides when part of his attention is still behind him. The channel he had described was real, and when Maggie walked north along the fence line 2 days later, she found the seep spring just as he had said. A shallow weeping of water from a rocky outcrop, not much more than a trickle, but cold and clear and reliable. She spent an afternoon cutting a shallow channel through the hardpan along her fence line with the mattock and a spade, and lined it with flat stones from the collapsed wall, and by the next morning a thin line of water was moving along the base of her fence and pooling near the south corner where she directed it with a flat stone placed just so. It was not irrigation in any grand sense, but it was life, and she was working with what life she could find. She saw Nelson at the fence 3 days later. Then again 3 days after that. He came in the mornings, always in the mornings, and always with some variation of the same posture, arms on the top rail, hat pushed back, watching. He never stayed long. He never said much. But he came, and she began to expect him the way she expected the sun, with a steadiness that she did not entirely examine because it did not seem like the time to examine it. He told her once in early May that the southern side of her house was better for the garden than the west, which she had already figured out, but which she let him explain because she could see he needed to be useful in some way he could name. He told her that the clay in this part of the county was underlaid with caliche in places, and it was worth testing before she decided where to dig. He told her she could find better topsoil near the dry creek bed than anywhere else on the property, which was true and which she had discovered herself. But she thanked him for it, and he nodded and looked away as though he had just given her a piece of information that cost him nothing, which he plainly believed was true. She began to understand that Nelson Hayes was a man who had closed himself around some old difficulty and had lived inside it long enough that the closing felt like character. He was not cold exactly, he was careful. He was a man who maintained fences as a matter of spiritual principle, who rose before the sun and worked until dark and ate alone and spoke plainly about practical things, and had convinced himself, through long practice, that this was a complete life. She learned these things gradually, the way you learn anything about a guarded person, through the cracks, through what they say without meaning to, through the things they do instead of the things they will not say. One of the things she learned came from Mrs. Hooper, who knew the history of Cutter's Creek the way a library knows books, completely and without particularly needing to be asked. Nelson Hayes had come to this part of Texas 12 years ago, at the age of 18, with his father, a rancher named George Hayes, who had built the operation from nothing and who had died 6 years later of a heart that gave out too soon. Nelson had been 24, and he had taken on the full weight of the ranch alone and had run it alone since then. He had been engaged once, years back, to a woman named Caroline something or other who had decided that Texas and the kind of life it required was not what she had imagined and had gone home to Virginia and presumably married someone with a house in a city and water that came from a tap. Nelson had not, to Mrs. Hooper's knowledge, been seriously attached to anyone since. Maggie turned this information over in her mind like one of her rocks, examining all its angles, and said nothing to Mrs. Hooper except thank you for the tea. By the middle of May the garden was genuinely, visibly alive. The beans were climbing the rough stake supports she had put in for them. The tomato plants had gone from fragile seedlings to sturdy green stems with tiny yellow flowers opening on them like small suns. The squash had sprawled outward with the cheerful aggression of a plant that has decided it owns the place, which in a way it did. Even the lettuce, which she had doubted in this heat, had come up thick and crisp in the shelter of the house's morning shadow. The sunflowers she had planted along the fence line were almost a foot tall, turning their faces east each morning with the diligent optimism of creatures that had made a commitment to the sun. The garden was, she had to admit, something more than practical now. It was beautiful. It was alive against the red dust in a way that caught you and held you if you stopped and looked at it, which she did every morning and which Nelson Hayes, she noticed, was doing too. He was at the fence more often now. The 3 days interval had become 2, then sometimes 1, and there had been a particular Tuesday when she had looked up at 7 in the morning and he was there, and when she had come out at 6:30, the following morning he was there again, and she began to suspect that the fence was less a boundary he happened to pass and more a destination he was choosing. She did not say this to him. She said good morning and he said good morning, and they talked about the garden and the weather and the soil and the water table, and whether the spring would keep running past June, and these were not, on the surface, romantic conversations. But they were the conversations of two people who were paying close attention to each other while pretending to be paying attention to something else. And there is a particular warmth in that kind of conversation that no amount of practicality can fully disguise. In late May, the trouble with Garland Voss began. Garland Voss ran a modest cattle operation on the south side of the county, and was the kind of man who read the weakness of others the way a buzzard reads the landscape, from a height, with patient attention. He had been trying to acquire the Underwood parcel for 2 years, before Raymond bought it and after, and he had not welcomed the news of Maggie's arrival with any warmth. He came to her property on a Wednesday afternoon, riding a dun horse with a white blaze and wearing a clean shirt that looked out of place on him, the way dressed-up intentions look on a man whose natural state is otherwise. He had a broad face and small eyes, and the manner of a man who has learned to be charming without becoming trustworthy. "Mrs. Underwood," he said, touching his hat, "I heard you were trying to make a go of it out here. Admirable thing." Maggie was standing at her well pulling up a bucket. She set it down and straightened and looked at him without excessive warmth. She had met Garland Voss type before. Missouri had its own versions of the same. "Mr. Voss," she said, "what can I do for you?" He offered her a number for the land. It was not an insulting number. It was a number chosen to be tempting, which was its own kind of insult because it assumed she was in the position of needing to be tempted. "The land isn't for sale," she said. He tried again, more earnestly, with arguments about the difficulty of water and the impracticality of a woman alone and the general hopelessness of the venture, all delivered in the friendly tone of a man who wants you to believe he is doing you a favor by taking something from you. "Still not for sale," Maggie said. He left politely, which she found less reassuring than if he had left with frustration. Politely meant he would come back. That evening she found that the channel she had cut along the fence line had been partially blocked, several flat stones displaced, and the thin flow of water diverted outward into the dust where it simply vanished. She could not prove it was Voss. It might have been an animal, might have been the ground settling, but it did not feel like either of those things. She cleared it and relayed the stones and watched the water resume its small, purposeful course, and she went inside and sat at her table in the lamplight and felt, for the first time since arriving, a thread of genuine worry. She told Nelson about Voss the next morning, not because she needed rescuing, but because she needed to know what she was dealing with, and he had been here 12 years and would know. He was at the fence at his usual time, and she came out with 2 mugs of coffee, which she had not done before. She handed one across the fence to him, and he took it with an expression of careful surprise. the expression of a man receiving something he had wanted and was not certain he had the right to want. She told him about Voss and the offer and the channel. His jaw tightened. "That's Voss," he said. "He's been wanting that parcel since before you came. He'll be back." "I know," she said. "What does he actually want with it?" "Water rights," Nelson said. "There's an underground source that runs under your 40 acres. Not much above ground, but below it's significant. Whoever holds your land holds those rights. Voss wants to expand his range south and he needs the water to do it." She considered this. "So the land isn't worthless," she said. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, not quite complete, the way a sun breaks clouds without coming all the way through. "Didn't say it had no value to anyone," he said. "Said it wasn't good for farming." "You said it was worthless," she said. "I may have," he said. "And—" He looked at the garden, which was bright and green and alive against the red earth, and he looked at it for a long moment. "I may have been speaking too quickly," he said. It was the closest thing to an admission of error she had likely ever hear from a man like Nelson Hayes, and she accepted it gravely and took a sip of her coffee and looked at the beans, which had new flowers on them this morning, and said nothing more about it. The problem with Voss escalated in June. The channel was blocked again, this time more decisively. The stones not merely displaced but removed entirely, and the channel itself partially filled with packed dirt. Then a length of her east fence was taken down, the boards not rotted through but pulled up cleanly, the marks of tools still on the post holes. And then one morning in the second week of June, she woke before dawn to the sound of cattle on her property. A dozen head of Voss cattle having wandered through the broken east fence and standing among her squash plants with the blissful indifference of animals who do not understand property lines. She went out in the early gray light and drove them off herself with a broom handle, then walked her fence line and found that 3 more sections had been pulled down. She stood in the early morning with the broom handle in her hand, and the eastern sky going pink and gold over the horizon, and she thought about the distance she had traveled and the work she had put in, and the garden that was alive behind her, and she felt something harden in her chest that was not anger, but was the thing that anger eventually becomes if you let it mature. Resolve. She put on her boots and her hat, and she saddled the horse she had bought from the livery in May, a steady brown mare she called Penny, and she rode the half-mile to the fence line where it bordered the Hayes property, and she called out and waited. Nelson came from the direction of his barn. He was in the middle of what appeared to be morning chores, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he came to the fence and looked at her face and said, without preamble, "What happened?" She told him. His expression in the morning light was something she had not seen from him before. It was not the careful neutral look he usually maintained, the weather report expression of a man keeping his feelings at appropriate professional distances. It was something more present than that, more involved, and it had an edge to it that was not directed at her. "You're certain it's Voss," he said. "I'm not certain of anything," she said, "but the fence boards didn't pull themselves." He thought for a moment with the focused look of a man running through options. "You need to file with the county land office," he said. "Document the damage, get it on record." "I know that," she said. "I'm going to town this morning, but I need the fence up before tonight or his cattle will be back in my squash." He was already turning back toward his barn. "I'll bring the tools," he said, as though that settled it, because for him it did. They spent 4 hours that morning rebuilding her east fence, Nelson and Maggie side by side in the growing heat, working with the wordless efficiency of people who know what they are doing and have respect for the work. He was good with his hands in the specific way of someone who has fixed and built and repaired things his whole life, and he moved with the unhurried competence that she had come to recognize as his particular signature, every motion direct and useful and without waste. She noticed, when they knelt side by side at a post that needed resetting, that his hands were rough and capable, and that he smelled like wood smoke and leather, and the particular clean outdoor scent of someone who rises early and spends the day in the open. She noticed these things and did not comment on them and went back to tamping dirt around the post with the back of her mattock. And when she looked up, she caught him looking at her, and they both looked elsewhere immediately, and neither of them said anything. But the air between them had a different quality after that, the quality of air in a room after someone has opened a window. She went to the county land office that afternoon and filed a report with the county recorder, a patient old man named Cribbs who wrote down everything she said in careful longhand, and shook his head slowly in the manner of someone who has recorded a great many injustices without being empowered to prevent any of them. She also spoke to the town marshal, a man named Arbuckle, who was competent enough but cautious in the way of officials who have to live among the people they police. Marshal Arbuckle came out 2 days later and spoke to Voss, who denied everything with the smooth ease of a man who has denied things before and found it generally effective. Nothing was resolved, but the fence incident stopped for a while, which Maggie took as evidence that documentation had value even when justice did not immediately follow it. Through all of this, Nelson was at the fence every morning. It was no longer 3 days or 2 days. It was every morning, and she no longer pretended to herself that this was coincidental. He brought himself and his coffee and sometimes a question about the garden, and sometimes they talked for 30 minutes and sometimes for 10, and sometimes in the middle of the work day, she would look up and see him at the fence from a distance, not talking, just there, the way a landmark is there, and she would look back down at what she was doing and something in her chest would be quieter than it had been a moment before. In the 3rd week of June, he brought her a book. This was so unexpected that she stood in her doorway for a moment, simply looking at it. It was a book about soil chemistry and land reclamation, a practical agricultural text, worn at the spine and annotated in the margins in a spare, angular handwriting. He held it over the fence as though it were not a personal thing at all, as though he were handing her a tool. "I found it in my father's things," he said. "He had ideas about the land around here, never got to do everything he wanted with them. I thought it might be useful." She took the book and turned it over and looked at the handwritten notes in the margins, close observations about soil type and moisture and drainage, and she looked up at Nelson Hayes standing at the fence in the morning light and understood something about him that she had not understood before. He had brought her his father's book. In the private vocabulary of guarded men, this was not a practical gesture. This was an opening. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in more ways than she said. "It's practical," he said, in the tone he used when he was not ready to admit something was more than practical. "Of course," she said. He came the next morning and she told him she had read 3 chapters and asked him about a note his father had made in the margin of the second, about the behavior of caliche layers under sustained moisture. He knew what the note meant. He had read the book himself clearly, and he talked about it with an openness she had not heard from him before, and she watched him as he talked and thought that this was what he looked like when he was not being careful, and she understood why he was usually careful, because this version of him, the version that was interested and alive and present, was something that could be taken from him if he was not careful, and it had been taken from him before. In July, the summer came down on the Texas Panhandle with the full weight of its intention, and the heat was something that had to be experienced to be understood, a heat that turned the sky white and made the red earth crack and sent everything with sense retreating into whatever shade it could find. The garden required constant attention in this heat. She watered it twice a day and covered the most vulnerable plants with cloth during the hottest part of the afternoon, and she talked to it sometimes, which she would not have admitted to any person but was nonetheless something she did, quiet encouragements in the early morning and the soft hours of evening when the air cooled just enough to breathe. The garden held, more than held. The tomatoes came in, red and heavy on the vine, more of them than she had expected, more than she could use herself. The beans were producing abundantly, and the squash had taken over the entire south side of the house, with the enthusiasm of a conquest. The sunflowers along the fence line were tall and golden and ridiculous and beautiful, turning their faces toward whatever light was available with a devotion she found admirable. She brought tomatoes to Nelson on a Thursday morning in mid-July. She brought them in her apron, half a dozen, and she held them over the fence, and he took them with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved, which looked very much like his regular expression, but had something behind the eyes that was different. "From the garden," she said, unnecessarily. "I can see that," he said. He turned one over in his hand and looked at it in the way of someone who is not looking at the tomato. "They came in good." "Better than I hoped," she said. "Better than I expected," he said, and looked up at her, and they were not, by this point, talking about the tomatoes at all, which they both understood and neither of them named. He came to dinner for the first time in late July. This had been arrived at through a negotiation so indirect and slow that neither of them would have been able to say exactly how it happened. She had mentioned she was making a proper meal with the garden's abundance. He had said that was a practical use of the produce. She had said there was enough for two. He had looked at the fence. She had looked at the fence. The fence had been there the whole time, doing its job, which was apparently to separate two people who were becoming increasingly inconvenienced by its presence. He came over that evening at 6 o'clock, having gone home and cleaned up, which she appreciated and did not mention. He knocked on the open door of her house with the kind of knock a man gives when he is uncertain of his welcome, even when it has been explicitly extended. And she called him in, and he came in and looked around her house with the particular look of a man entering a place where someone has made something of a difficult situation. She had. The house was not large, but it was neat and warm, and she had hung a piece of yellow calico at the window and brought in a jar of sunflowers from the garden, and the smell of the food she was cooking, beans and corn bread and stewed tomatoes with sage, filled the small space with the generous, unmistakable smell of someone who knows how to cook for more than their own survival. He sat at the table and they ate, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about the land and the water and the history of the county and his father's work and her family in Missouri, and the difference between the soil in the East and the soil here, and about books, and about the long, slow work of understanding something difficult. And none of this on its surface was personal, but all of it was, and they both knew it. When he stood to leave, he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than leaving required. "This was a good evening," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." He looked at her in the lamplight with the careful look that was less careful now, more open, the way a door looks when it has been used. "I'll be at the fence in the morning," he said. "I know," she said. Something in his face shifted at that, a small, significant thing, like the first movement of a heavy door on hinges that have been still a long time. Then he put his hat on and walked out into the dark, and she stood in the doorway and listened to him ride away and held the evening in her hands for a while, the way you hold something good when you are not yet accustomed to having it. He was at the fence in the morning, and the morning after, and the one after that. Garland Voss came back in August. He came with a man from a land company in Fort Worth, a man in a city suit named Prescott who had paper money and a briefcase, and the polished manner of someone sent to finalize transactions that have already been decided on his end. They came on a Tuesday morning when the heat was already fierce and sat in a buggy at the edge of the road, and Voss called out for Maggie in a voice that assumed she would come when called. She came because she chose to, which was different. Prescott offered her a formal purchase price for the land. It was significantly more than Voss had offered in May, which meant they wanted it more than they had then, which meant the underground water rights were more valuable than she had understood. She listened to all of it with the patience of a woman who has not come 2,000 miles to be purchased out of her own property. "No, thank you," she said. Prescott's polished manner acquired a small crack. He started again, with different words but the same essential argument, which was that she was a woman alone, and the land was difficult, and the money was good, and reason should prevail. "Reason does prevail," Maggie said pleasantly. And reason tells me that if this land is worth this much to you, it is worth keeping. Voss's face had been getting darker throughout this exchange. He leaned forward in the buggy. Mrs. Underwood, he said, in a voice that had dropped the friendly performance, this county is a long way from anywhere. Things can get difficult for a person working a piece of land alone. The threat was not quite stated, but it was entirely clear, the way a storm is clear on a horizon before it arrives. Before Maggie could answer, she heard hooves behind her. She turned, and Nelson Hayes was riding across her property from the direction of the fence, at a pace that was not hurried but was decisive, and he pulled up his horse near the buggy and looked at Voss with the gray eyes that were, in this moment, very much not neutral. "Afternoon, Garland," he said. Voss looked at him and recalibrated something. Nelson Hayes was not someone who could be spoken to in the same tone as a woman alone, not by any of the calculations Voss made, which said a great deal about Voss, and was an injustice Maggie did not miss even as she was grateful for the backup. "Hayes," Voss said. "I heard the last part of that," Nelson said, looking at Voss with the specific expression of a man who has decided where the line is and is standing on his side of it. "I'd recommend against the direction you were going." Prescott said something quietly to Voss. Voss looked at Maggie and then at Nelson, and then at the garden behind Maggie, which in its fullness and greenness was a fairly eloquent argument for everything she had said. Then Voss straightened in the buggy with the stiff dignity of a man retreating while pretending he is not. "We'll be in touch," Prescott said. "You're welcome to," Maggie said, "and the answer will be the same." They drove away. The dust of their departure settled slowly in the still August air. Maggie turned and looked at Nelson, who was sitting his horse looking at the road the buggy had taken. "I had it," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I was about to say something considerably less polite." "I know," he said, and he looked at her, and there was something in the gray eyes that was warm now, genuinely and straightforwardly warm without the careful covering. "I didn't come because I thought you needed saving. I came because I wanted to be here." She looked at him for a moment. The August light was fierce and golden, and the sunflowers behind her were at their peak, full and blazing and turned toward the east, and the garden smell was in the air, hot and green and real. "Come down from that horse then," she said. He dismounted. They walked the garden together for the first time, not just him looking from the fence but both of them inside the fence, among the growing things, and he asked her about every plant with genuine interest, and she told him about each one, and they moved slowly down the rows with the unhurried ease of people who have stopped pretending they have somewhere else to be. At the end of the south row, near the stone wall where the ground was darkest and the lavender she had planted in June was in full, fragrant bloom, he stopped. She stopped beside him. The lavender smell was everywhere, clean and sweet and extraordinary in the dust and heat of a Texas August. "I've never seen anything like this out here," he said quietly. He meant the garden. He also meant more than the garden. "I couldn't see it when I first arrived," Maggie said. "I could only see what it might be." He looked at her. The careful look was completely gone now. She had not seen him without it before, and the man she saw without it was the man she had been catching glimpses of for months, direct and warm and somewhat wary, the way someone looks when they want something they have not yet given themselves permission to want. "Maggie," he said, and stopped. "Nelson," she said. "I have been at that fence every morning for 6 months," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not an explanation but a confession, and she could see what it cost him to say it, a man who had been careful for so long that the muscle of openness had to be worked back into use. "I know," she said. "I was wrong about the land," he said. "And I may have been wrong about some other things." "You may have been," she agreed. He reached out then with the same directness he brought to everything, and he took her hand, and she let him take it, and they stood in the lavender in the August heat and looked at each other, and something settled between them that had been unsettled for a long time, something mutual and quiet and solid as the stone in the wall beside them. "I'd like to keep coming in the mornings," he said. "I'd like that too," she said. He was still holding her hand. He looked down at it, at her hand in his, and something moved through his face that was the expression of a man who has been alone inside a closed place for a very long time and has just, for the first time in years, allowed a window to be opened. "Not just at the fence," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not just at the fence." He lifted her hand then and held it to his mouth and pressed his lips to the back of it with a formality that was, somehow, more intimate than anything else could have been. And when he looked up there was something unmistakable in the gray eyes, something that had been there for a long time and was now no longer being kept back. She did not look away from it. She let it be seen, and she let him see the same thing in her face, which was the same thing wearing a different face. Two people finally deciding to stop translating something that did not need translation. In September, Nelson Hayes began coming for dinner regularly. This was understood by Cutter's Creek to mean something specific, because in a town of 200 people in 1882, a man who comes for dinner regularly has made an announcement, whether or not he has said any particular words. Mrs. Hooper told Maggie one afternoon in the general store that the town had formed opinions about the development, and Maggie said she was glad to hear the town had plenty to occupy it. Nelson brought her things, practical things in the way of a man who expresses care through function. A proper watering can to replace the bucket system she had been using, a roll of good wire for reinforcing the east fence, a bag of mature compost from his own operation that he carried over the fence one morning and deposited near the garden with the brief explanatory statement that it would help with the clay, and then stood back with the expression of a man waiting to see if a gift has been understood, which it had. She brought him things, too, in the way she understood care. Food from the garden, jars of preserved tomatoes and beans, a loaf of corn bread still warm from the oven. She fixed a sleeve on one of his work shirts that had come unsewn at the shoulder, returning it over the fence one morning without particular ceremony, and he looked at the careful stitching for a moment before folding it over his arm and saying thank you in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice. In October the garden began winding down, as gardens do, the last tomatoes coming in, the squash exhausted and the beans finished, the ground cooling at night now and the mornings carrying the first suggestion of what would come. But the sunflowers along the fence line were still standing, somewhat battered by September's weather but still tall and golden, and the lavender was still fragrant, and the herbs she had planted in the spring had seeded themselves through the amended soil in ways that suggested they intended to come back. Maggie was planning the next year's garden before October was half finished. She was planning it bigger and she was planning it better, with the knowledge of one full season behind her. She had learned which parts of the ground would hold moisture and which would drain. She knew where the morning shade fell, and where the afternoon sun was direct and merciless. She knew the caliche layer and the clay, and where the good soil from the creek bed had made the most difference. She had a notebook full of observations written in the evenings by lamplight, and she was filling it still, drawing diagrams and making notes and planning for the spring with the particular joy of someone who has learned through practice that the thing they love can actually be done. Nelson looked at the notebook one evening at dinner and read through her plans with the focused attention he brought to anything that interested him, which was now a long list that included her garden, her opinions on most subjects, and the way she laughed, which was a whole-face laugh that he appeared to find personally significant. "You're planning an orchard," he said, looking at a diagram she had sketched. "Eventually," she said. "The south side of the property, apple trees and peach trees. The peach trees should do well in this climate if I amend the soil properly." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a 20-year project," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her across the table with the warm, unguarded look that she now had the measure of. "That means you're planning to be here in 20 years, he said. "I'm planning to be here permanently," she said. "That was always the plan." The gray eyes settled on her. "Then I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "When you first came and I told you the land was worthless," he said slowly, in the manner of a man choosing words with greater care than he usually bothered with. "I was trying to convince you to go before you could become someone it would matter to me to lose." The room was very quiet. Outside, the October wind moved in a way that sounded like the whole landscape breathing. "That is," Maggie said carefully, "a thing worth knowing." "I thought so," he said. "You did a very poor job of convincing me," she said. "You are a very difficult person to convince," he said, and there it was again, the suggestion of a smile that he generally kept from arriving quite completely, and she had decided some time back that she was going to do something about that. She stood up from the table and came around to his side, and he turned in the chair and looked up at her, and she took his face in her hands, both hands, and kissed him. He was still for only a moment. Then his hands came up and he pulled her close with a care and a certainty that was entirely like him, careful and certain at once. And she felt in it the months of fence mornings and practical conversations and books passed over rails and tomatoes brought in aprons. All of it collected into this moment, which was the most honest thing that had happened between them, and which was a very long time coming. When she pulled back, his eyes were open and looking at her, and the careful, guarded expression was entirely gone, replaced by something that looked, on the face of Nelson Hayes, like a man who has come home after being away for a long time and is just now understanding that the traveling part is over. "I have been trying to ask you something for 2 months," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "Maggie," he said, "I am asking you to marry me." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had been studying for 6 months through mornings and meals and conversations across fence rails, at the man who had told her the land was worthless and then watched it bloom and been honest enough eventually to admit what that meant. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh but was in the family of one. He pulled her close again and held her, and she could feel him breathing, steady and slow. And outside, the October wind moved over the brown and gold Texas land, and the fence between the two properties stood exactly where it always had, doing its job, which was now primarily ceremonial. They were married in November of 1882. The ceremony was small by Missouri standards but substantial by Cutter's Creek standards, which amounted to the same degree of social significance. It was held at the church with the cracked bell, and the bell was rung anyway, crack and all, and approximately 60 people attended from the surrounding ranches and farms, and the town itself, because word had gotten around, and the general feeling in the community was one of satisfaction. The satisfaction of a thing that has been building for a long time finally arriving. Mrs. Hooper wept happily. Beaumont shook Nelson's hand with the gravity of a man who approved. Cord from the livery threw his hat in the air. Even Marshal Arbuckle came, standing at the back with his arms crossed in a way that suggested professional composure but included a smile. Maggie wore her good dress, the green one she had brought from Missouri, and she had wound sprigs of the dried lavender from her garden into her hair, and she stood at the altar beside Nelson Hayes, who was wearing a clean dark jacket that he wore the way all practical men wear formal clothes, with the air of someone who has made an accommodation to the moment. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the vows they exchanged were the standard words of 1882, but underneath them ran the private language of 6 months of mornings and fence rails and soil and growing things, and it was that private language that they were actually speaking. After the ceremony there was a supper at the church hall. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a guitar. There was dancing, and Nelson Hayes, who no one in Cutter's Creek would have predicted as a man who danced with his wife, slowly and with the careful physical confidence of a man who applied himself to everything. And Maggie leaned against him and felt the solidness of him, and thought about the 40 acres of red clay she had turned by hand in the spring and everything that had grown from it. That night they went home to his house, which was larger and better furnished than her small house on the Underwood parcel, and which she was prepared to improve in ways that would become apparent over time. They came into the house and lit the lamps and looked at each other in the warm light, and there was the simplest kind of joy in the room, the joy of two people who have arrived somewhere they have both been trying to get to without quite admitting it. In the following weeks, the Underwood parcel, now folded practically into the Hayes operation, became the subject of a formal legal arrangement. Nelson had a meeting with a lawyer in town, and the water rights issue was resolved in writing in a way that made clear that no amount of Voss's persistence would change the underlying reality. Voss made one more approach in December with a new offer, and Nelson and Maggie sat across a table from him at Beaumont's store and said no together, which was apparently more discouraging than either of them had managed separately, because Voss went away and directed his water ambitions elsewhere, and the matter was settled. The small house on the Underwood parcel was cleaned and maintained, and Nelson hired it out to a young couple, a man named Everett and his wife Delia, who had come to the county looking for a start and who were grateful for the arrangement, and who turned out to be good neighbors, which in this country meant something substantial. Maggie moved her garden plans to the south side of the Hayes house, which had better water access and a longer stretch of workable ground. She worked through the winter planning it and through February beginning the soil preparation, and when the spring of 1883 came, she planted on a scale that was 3 times what she had managed on the Underwood parcel. Nelson built her proper raised beds along the south wall of the house, working on it in the evenings after the cattle work was done, carrying boards and nailing them together with the same focused application he brought to everything. And she painted the beds red because she liked red, and because by now he knew that her opinions about color and beauty were not negotiable. The orchard she had planned from the beginning got its first trees in the spring of 1883, 6 apple trees and 4 peach trees, planted in the southeast corner of the property where the drainage was best, small and hopeful and long-sighted in the way of orchards, which are not planted for the person who plants them, but for the life that will come after. That spring, Maggie learned she was expecting their first child. She told Nelson on an April morning, the same month she had arrived in Cutter's Creek a year before. She told him in the garden, which seemed right, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before, something open and unguarded and enormous, the expression of a man to whom something so large has happened that all his careful habits have been temporarily suspended. He put his arms around her and held her, and she could feel him breathing, unsteady and deliberate at the same time, working through something. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. "When?" he managed. "October," she said. He held her at arm's length and looked at her with the gray eyes that were, in this moment, not gray at all but something warmer and more complicated, and she could see him doing the thing he always did, which was understanding something that had just changed and adjusting to its reality with steady, deliberate honesty. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly well," she said. He looked at the garden, the spring garden just beginning, the soil freshly turned and the young plants just setting their roots, and then back at her. "You'll tell me if you need to rest more," he said. "I will work this garden until the week before," she said, "and then I will rest and then I will be back." He seemed to understand from experience now that arguing with her about this was a project that would not prosper. He pulled her back against him and rested his chin on top of her head and looked out over the spring land, the green-brown promise of it, the young orchard trees in their careful row, the whole enterprise of the life they were building. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she said. "For not leaving in the spring," he said, "when I told you the land was worthless." She laughed against his chest. "You almost convinced me," she lied. "You have never been almost convinced of anything in your life," he said, with the warmth that was now his default when he talked to her, the warmth she had worked out of him like water from that deep-running spring, slowly and steadily, until it found its way to the surface. The summer of 1883 was different from the summer before in ways that were large and small. The garden was larger and better and fuller, and Maggie worked it with the knowledge of someone in their second year, confident and systematic, and the yield was extraordinary. Tomatoes and beans and squash again, and this year corn and peppers and a long row of sweet peas along the east fence because she had decided the east fence deserved something beautiful. The sunflowers went along the original fence line, the one that had bordered the Underwood property, though they were on the Hayes side now, and the fence between the two properties existed in a different and more friendly sense. Nelson found her one morning in late June standing in the corn with her hands on the leaves and her eyes closed, and he stopped and watched her for a moment with the expression he wore when he thought she could not see him, which was the most honest expression he had, the one without any management, just a man looking at the thing he loves with the full weight of it. "What are you doing?" he said. "Listening," she said. "To the corn." "To the morning," she said. "There's a mockingbird in the cedar post. The corn smells like the corn at home. And you rode over from the barn instead of walking, which means you have been up since before 5, and you thought I would not notice." He made a sound that was fully, completely a laugh, which remained one of the most purely pleasing things she had encountered. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and he was looking at her with the whole of his face, nothing held back, and the morning was warm and golden, and somewhere in the cedar post a mockingbird was going through its entire repertoire with competitive thoroughness. "Come see the tomatoes," she said, and he came. In October, on a Thursday morning when the pecans in the county were dropping and the first real cold had come down from the north, Maggie went into labor with their first child. Nelson rode for the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Fairweather, who had delivered more of Cutter's Creek citizens than anyone could count, and he came back and waited, and he did not, for once in his life, pretend to be less concerned than he was. Their son was born near midnight, healthy and loud, and possessed from the very first minute of an opinion that he intended to communicate regardless of who was listening. Nelson held him with the careful, complete attention of a man for whom nothing more important has ever happened, and the child looked up at him with the unfocused but confident gaze of a person who has just arrived somewhere and is already taking stock. They named him George William Hayes, George for Nelson's father and William for Maggie's, and he was red-faced and strong-lunged, and as he grew through that winter and into the next spring, curious about everything in the manner of a person who has been born into a household where the garden is a laboratory and the land is a conversation. The following spring, 1884, the apple trees bloomed for the first time. They were still young trees, the blooms small and tentative, but they were there, white against the April blue, and Maggie walked through them with George on her hip, showing him the flowers, explaining what they would become in the way that she explained everything to him, directly and fully, as though he could understand every word, which she believed he could. Nelson came up beside them and put his arm around her and looked at the blooming trees with the expression of a man who has learned, through experience, to see things not only as they are but as they might become, which is a particular education that Maggie Underwood had given him, and which had changed, in ways he was still discovering, the whole character of how he moved through his days. Garland Voss had moved his operation southward after the land rights matter was settled, and was heard of occasionally but not encountered directly, which was the best possible arrangement. The county had grown that year, new families arriving, a new schoolteacher who was, by all accounts, reliably sober. A telegraph line was being discussed for the main road. The town of Cutter's Creek was not exactly flourishing, but it was persisting with more energy than before, which in this landscape was the beginning of flourishing. Everett and Delia in the small Underwood house had a baby girl that spring and named her Ruth, and she and George, only 6 months apart, grew into the companionable rivalry of near-age children on neighboring properties. Nelson and Everett worked out an informal arrangement about the water rights and the grazing, and it suited both of them well, and the understanding grew into something like friendship, which added a dimension to the social life of the Hayes household that Nelson, who had spent years in relative solitude, approached with the careful appreciation of someone discovering that company, the right company, was something he had actually wanted. In 1885, their second child came, a daughter they named Clara after Maggie's sister, which made the real Clara in Missouri cry when she received the letter, a crying that Maggie could visualize clearly from 2,000 miles away. Clara Hayes arrived in February with less drama than her brother had, but with an equal amount of opinion. And by the time she was 6 months old, she had established herself as the most determined presence in any room she occupied, which her father found alternately challenging and entirely wonderful. The garden had by now spread significantly beyond its original form. Maggie had worked the soil along the entire south and east sides of the house, had built a cold frame for starting seeds early, had constructed a proper composting system that Nelson had contributed to engineering, and which they both maintained with the cooperative thoroughness of two people who have merged their practical knowledge into something better than either had alone. The herb garden ran the length of the kitchen wall, a thick, aromatic border of sage and thyme and rosemary and lavender, always lavender, and in summer the smell of it came through the kitchen window and mixed with whatever was cooking on the stove. The peach trees bore their first real fruit in the summer of 1885. Not many, a dozen peaches on the most established tree, small and imperfect and the most extraordinary thing Maggie had tasted since arriving in Texas. She brought them in from the tree one morning with George toddling behind her on sturdy 2-year-old legs, and she set them on the kitchen table, and Nelson came in from the morning's work and stopped in the doorway. "Are those," he said. "Peaches," she said. He sat down at the table and she brought him one and he bit into it, and the juice ran down his chin, and he did not bother to wipe it away immediately, and she stood watching him and laughed at the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man for whom a peach from an impossible tree on land he had called worthless has just become one of the finest things he has ever eaten. "Maggie," he said. "Told you," she said. He looked at her. "You told me nothing about peaches." "I told you there would be an orchard," she said. "You did," he said. "And you said it was a 20-year project," she said. "It's been 3 years," he said. "It's a beginning," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand he had taken in the lavender on that August afternoon when everything changed between them, and held it the way he held most things, with a steadiness that was not the absence of feeling but the form that his particular feeling took. "Thank you," he said, "for the peach, for coming here," he said, "for not leaving, for planting things in impossible ground." She turned her hand over and held his back. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "You started it alone," he said. "I started it," she agreed. "And then you leaned on a fence and watched, and I suppose that helped too." He made the laugh sound. "I did a great deal more than lean on a fence," he said. "Eventually," she said. "Eventually," he admitted. Outside, the August heat lay over the land in the old familiar way, the sky enormous and pale above the flat and rolling ground, and the garden was full and the orchard was small and growing, and somewhere near the cold frame the lavender was in its second full summer, steady and fragrant and persistent, having decided a long time ago that this was where it belonged. George came in from the yard at a run, red-faced and intent, trailing something that might have been a stick or might have been a toy of unclear origin, and crashed into Nelson's leg without slowing and was picked up and held against his father's shoulder. And the three of them were in the kitchen in the August heat, and Clara was asleep in the next room, and outside the garden was doing what it always did, which was growing without being asked. The following years built on each other, with the steady accumulation of a life lived on deliberate ground. The orchard matured slowly, as orchards must, but the peach trees put on fruit each summer, and the apple trees, slower and more measured, began to produce in the autumn of 1886 with the thoughtful abundance of something that has been waiting for the right conditions and has found them. Maggie made preserves and applesauce and apple butter, and lined the shelves of the cellar with jars that glowed amber and red and dark green in the lamplight. And when winter came and the Texas panhandle put on the gray and brown clothing of its cold season, the cellar was full, and the house smelled of cinnamon and preserved fruit, and the particular warmth of a place well stocked against difficulty. George Hayes was an outdoor child, following his father on the cattle operations with single-minded persistence from the age he could stay on a horse, which was earlier than Maggie entirely approved of, but which she accepted because the look on Nelson's face when his son rode beside him was not something she was prepared to deprive either of them of. George was serious and capable in the manner of his father, with his mother's directness and her habit of looking at the ground as though it were telling him something important. Clara was different, more verbal and social, and interested in the people around her with an intensity that was sometimes inconvenient, asking questions of everyone she met with the determination of someone who has decided that knowing things is a right and not a privilege. She followed Maggie in the garden with the focused assistance of a child who is actually trying to help, which meant she was sometimes more help and sometimes considerably more hindrance, but the spirit of it was right, and Maggie let her have the small section of the east bed that was definitively hers to plant and tend as she chose. Clara planted zinnias. Nelson Hayes watched his daughter in the garden one morning, watched her thin, serious hands pressing seeds into the amended soil with the precise, careful motions of someone who has been taught properly, and he came to stand beside Maggie at the edge of the bed. "She looks like you," he said. "She has your jaw," Maggie said. "She has your garden," he said. Maggie looked at Clara in the morning light, dark-haired and intent, putting zinnias in the ground with the conviction of a person who is entirely certain the effort is worth making. "The zinnias will come up orange and yellow," Maggie said. "How do you know?" Nelson said. "Because those are the seeds I gave her," she said. "And because she needs a good result this first year. Next year I'll let her choose her own seeds." He put his arm around her shoulders in the easy, habitual way of two people who have been touching each other for years and have worn the habit into something as natural as breathing. "You think of everything," he said. "I think of what I need to think of," she said. In 1887, Maggie's sister Clara came to visit from Missouri, the real Clara, who had sent letters full of worry and curiosity since Maggie's departure, and who had been invited every year, and had finally gathered herself to make the trip. She arrived on a warm September day and stood in front of the Hayes house and looked at the garden and the orchard and the properly maintained fence and the solid, occupied reality of her sister's life, and said nothing for a full minute. "You actually did it," she said. "Did what?" Maggie said. "All of it," Clara said. Nelson met Clara at dinner that evening, and endured with good grace the particular scrutiny of a woman assessing the man who has married her sister, which is a scrutiny with its own vocabulary and conventions, and which Nelson navigated, in Maggie's observation, with credit. He was direct and warm in the way Maggie had learned to recognize as his best and most honest self, and by the end of the evening Clara had directed at Maggie, across the table, a small private nod that meant everything was satisfactory, which was one of the more valuable opinions Maggie would receive that year. Clara stayed 2 weeks and helped in the garden in the mornings and played with George and Clara, and listened to Maggie talk about the land with the particular patience of a sister, who understands that she is hearing about something that goes deeper than horticulture. On her last evening she sat with Maggie on the porch in the cool September dark and said, "I was so worried when you came here." "I know," Maggie said. "I thought it was grief," Clara said. "Raymond dying and you not knowing what else to do." "It wasn't grief," Maggie said. "Or not only, I knew what I was doing." "You didn't know about him," Clara said, tilting her head toward the house where Nelson was reading to George and Clara in the lamplight, the low sound of his voice carrying through the open window. "No," Maggie admitted. "I didn't know about him." Clara was quiet for a moment. "But you stayed anyway," she said. "I stayed for the garden," Maggie said. "And then I stayed for everything else." The September air came in over the flat land, warm still but with the first edge of autumn in it, and from inside the house came Nelson's voice reading and the children's voices interrupting, which was the sound of evenings in that house, the comfortable, unpolished music of a family that has made itself out of intention and work, and the particular stubbornness that comes from deciding to stay. By 1888, the garden was a neighborhood institution. Other women came to see it, and Maggie showed them what she had learned about amending the clay soil and about water conservation, and about the varieties of vegetable that did best in the heat, and the particular challenges of the Texas Panhandle growing season. She shared seeds freely and gave advice when asked, and was asked more often as her reputation as a grower spread through the county, and she took genuine pleasure in watching other small gardens appear behind other houses, tentative at first, and then growing bolder. The orchard by this year was something to stand in and feel the achievement of. The apple trees were at the height of a man's shoulder and above, properly limbed and shaped from years of careful attention, and in the autumn they bore apples in quantity, red-streaked and sweet, and the peach trees in summer were loaded with the golden, fragrant abundance of established fruit trees that have finally come into their own. Nelson and Maggie and the children picked the fruit together in the evenings after the heat of the day had passed, the four of them moving through the trees in the long, copper-colored light, filling baskets. And this was among the images Maggie carried inside her always, the simplest and most complete image of what had been made from that first stubborn spring, when she had turned red clay with a mattock, and told a gray-eyed man at a fence that she knew what she was doing. Nelson came to the fence every morning until the fence no longer existed as a fence in the original sense, because the fence had been incorporated into the life of the garden, and the garden had grown up to it and beyond it, the sunflowers along it every summer, the sweet peas climbing it every spring. But he came every morning nonetheless, to the garden to her, with the steadiness of a man for whom a thing done once with intention becomes a habit, and a habit becomes, after long enough, simply who you are. She found him there one morning in the spring of 1889, standing at what had been the fence line, his hat in his hands, looking at the orchard which was in bloom, the apple trees covered in white flowers against the April blue sky. He did not hear her come up beside him, and she stood there a moment looking at his face, at the face she knew better now than any other face in the world, and at what was on it, which was a kind of quiet and abundant happiness that sat well on a man who had spent a long time without it and had learned to receive it with the honest attention it deserved. She put her hand through his arm. He looked down at her. "I was thinking about my father," he said. "He would have loved the orchard," she said. "He would have loved all of it," Nelson said. "He would have loved you." She leaned against him and looked at the apple trees in flower, the white petals moving in the April wind. "I planted those for the future," she said. "I know," he said. "They're here now," she said. "They are," he said. "Worth it?" she asked. He looked at her. The gray eyes were warm and steady, and entirely without the careful covering she had first encountered at this fence line 7 years ago, and the look in them was one she had read 1,000 times now and never tired of reading, which is the nature of a look from someone who has given you the full weight of their honesty and their love without holding anything back. "Worth it," he said. The apple blossoms moved in the wind. Somewhere behind them George, at 6 years old, was demanding that his sister help him with something she clearly had no intention of helping with, and Clara, at 4, was explaining her position at considerable and articulate length, and the chickens that Maggie had added to the operation 2 years ago were carrying on their own conversation near the barn, and the cattle moved in the distance on the good grass of the Hayes range. And the sunflower seeds she had put in along the fence yesterday had the whole of spring and summer ahead of them to become what they were going to become. She stood in the apple orchard with her husband in the April morning and felt the ground under her feet, the ground she had turned with her own hands and argued with and fed and watered and coaxed into something alive. And she felt it give back under her, not yielding but responsive, the way good earth responds when it has been understood, And she thought of the morning she had arrived with her 2 trunks and her carpet bag, and a dead husband's 40 acres and the absolute, unshakable conviction that she was not going to cry about what the land looked like because she could see what it might become. She had been right. She had known what she was doing. And Nelson Hayes had stood at a fence and watched every morning, until watching was no longer enough. And then he had come over. That was the truth of it, the whole of it, the story of the land and the garden and the 2 people who had met at a fence line in the spring of 1882 and had, over the long and steady course of seasons and soil and work and love, made something out of what they had, which was considerable, once they stopped calling it worthless. They planted the next row of sweet peas along the fence that afternoon, Nelson and Maggie side by side on their knees in the April earth, and the children helped, more or less, and the work was warm and real and had the quality of all the best work, which is that it is also, at its heart, a kind of joy. The peach trees smelled like something promised and kept. The orchard grew, as orchards do, in its own good time. And the garden that had been called impossible was green and full and entirely, completely, unarguably alive.